Okay, welcome everybody. You're gonna notice that I'm actually recording from my car today. I'm on the road, so hopefully this doesn't cause any problems. But we're gonna be having a cheery topic today. Actually, this whole week it's going to be like not so cheery. We're gonna be talking about abortion. If we get the time, we're also gonna be talking about um, kind of like genetic engineering and reproductive technologies. We're definitely going to be talking about euthanasia, right? Or medical assisted suicide or medical aid in dying, right? There are all sorts of different terms that people use, generally depending on your political opinions, sensibilities, however you want to put it. Um, and if we get the chance, we're also going to be talking about hospice. So I want to say a couple things first here, right? Just before we begin. Um, First thing is I understand that this material is going to be like highly controversial. And I'm sure that like most of you guys have opinions on this. And if you have opinions on this, um, you're probably going to be emotionally invested in some way. And I'm going to be trying to cover a range of opinions. Now, generally, like a range of opinions which go outside of just like the general public discourse, but like a range of opinions which I'm sure you'll disagree with probably most of them nonetheless. Um, and what I really want from everybody, right? And I know this is a lot to ask, right? I'm not necessarily asking that you change your mind. I actually don't really expect you guys to change your mind. But what I really want people to do is to understand the different viewpoints, to grasp the intricacies of things, and then to hopefully understand things in a very non-polarized or like cartoonish manner. Um, if you're pro-life, if you're pro-choice, if you support medical aid in dying, if you don't, I don't expect you guys to like change your view. I really don't. Um, but I do want you to try and recognize other points of views and try and see some sort of arguments at the very kind of the arguments that they have, and maybe try and to some extent empathize with them in like some sort of intellectual sense. Um, yeah, I hope that makes sense. I don't think that this is like I haven't had any issues with this before. I'll say that. This is the first time I'm teaching online, so we'll see. But do what you can to just understand the material and really grasp it. At the very least, to try and um just try and kind of build up your own point of views, right? In a more structural and sound manner. The other thing I also want to acknowledge is that these topics, especially abortion and medical aid and dying, um, are going to affect people, right? They're going to be relevant to people's lives. Without a doubt, there are people in this class who have been affected by these topics. Um, and I think recognizing that is really important. We don't want to just be kind of talking about things in a very fanciful manner and like ignoring that these actually touch people's lives. But recognizing this also, I think, develops some sort of empathy for people with different viewpoints, right? As a philosopher, I'm not sure how many of you guys have taken philosophy classes before, but like philosophers kind of have like a bad tendency to sort of like come up with these like ridiculous cases. And sometimes that can seem like it's almost like belittling the topic which we're talking about. Um, and I want to do my best to not do that. Although we are going to be talking about some like kind of fanciful cases, but I don't think it's going to belittle them. Okay, that's it. Just do what you can to understand different viewpoints, and also just understand that these topics are going to affect some of your classmates' life. Even if they don't affect your life, they're going to affect some of your classmates' lives. Or they would have affected it, or they will. Um, and understand that for any sort of communication which you have in your classmates or even in your assignments, right? Okay, let's get into this. So we're doing abortion today. Okay. So very classically, all right, abortion and topics of the permissibility of abortion, they've hinged on, oh, sorry, I should have prepared some of this beforehand. I think I do 170. Yeah, here we go. They hinge on whether the fetus is a moral person. Okay. A little bit about what I mean by moral person. Um, I don't mean whether or not the fetus is human in some sort of biological sense. There is some obvious sense, right, where a fetus has human DNA, right? By moral person, what I really mean is whether or not the fetus deserves the same rights, we could say. I'm a little hesitant to say that, but we'll just go with it, right? The same rights as the rest of us. Okay. Or maybe we could say whether or not the fetus deserves the respect that regular people have, or the regular people do. We'll say that. So, a moral person is a philosophical term, right? Um, we could talk about like the moral status of it. We don't necessarily just mean human. We're talking about essentially whether or not it deserves some level of moral respect, or the level of moral respect which we would take for humans, right? Um, Now, most people, right, may go ahead and they'll say, I mean, by the way, there's kind of like in between views here, right? You could go ahead and say, we're not going to cover these very much, but you could go ahead and say, like, look, a fetus deserves moral respect, but not as much moral respect as a baby or an adult or something like that. That's going to be like similar to what people say about, or what most people say about like animals. Most people believe that dogs deserve some moral respect, but you should probably prioritize humans above dogs, or at least horses or cows or whatever like that. Um, but yeah, like a philosophical in philosophy talk, a moral person doesn't just mean a human, it means someone who deserves the same level of moral respect that most of us do. Now, we can think about kind of fanciful cases where we have some moral person who's not actually human. I mean, you can think about aliens and pop culture, right? I mean, I think Chewbacca probably deserves moral respect in the Star Wars universe. Like, if Chewbacca was alive, uh, we shouldn't kill Chewbacca, right? I think that's the case. Um, but this is what we're talking about. So it's possible, right? It's possible that a fetus has human DNA, but does not deserve or is not a moral person, right? If that makes sense. Okay. Let's talk about some like traditional views. Um, Here's like the traditional pro-life view. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard this, but I want to analyze this in a very like non-cartoony fashion, right? I want to add some level of plausibility to this because this is a view that, millions upon millions of people hold to this day. And we don't need to agree with it, but it's important to understand it, right? Um, a traditional, sensible pro-life person is going to say something like this. A fetus is a moral person, and thus it deserves the right to life, or thus it has the right to life. The right to life is more important than the right to bodily autonomy, and thus abortion is impermissible. Okay. Oh, there we go. I should say, right, um, that no sensible person, no sensible person, is going to say something like, women don't have the right to bodily autonomy. Right. And let me explain what I mean by this. And I'm not trying to say that there are no sensible people who are pro-life, by the way. Um, but no sensible person's going to say that a woman does not have the right to bodily autonomy. Uh, any sensible and respectable moral philosopher, any respectable ethicist is going to say that both bodily autonomy and the right to life, whether or not the fetus has that or not, whether or not it's a person, right, are important. But the question is, what happens when these conflict, right? So I've talked about dilemmas, right? I talked about them in our general ethics lecture. And a dilemma is when you have one reason to act one way and another reason to act another way. A lot of people are going to view um, abortion, right? Let's just assume that the fetus is a moral life. A lot of people are going to take abortion as being a case where you cannot uphold both the woman's right to her bodily autonomy if she chooses to have an abortion, of course, right? While also upholding the fetus's right to life. And someone who's, a sensible pro-life person is not going to just disregard the importance of bodily autonomy. But what they're going to do is they're going to say, look, it is, I think this is like put in a very light way, but it's a major shame in some like very oomphy way, right? Like some way that really matters. It's a major shame and it's a major loss that in this case we cannot respect the woman's right to bodily autonomy. However, we believe that the right of the fetus to live, right, the right of the person to live, right, they take it to be a person, outweighs the right to bodily autonomy. And I mean, like, you can agree with this, you can disagree with this, but to some extent you can make sense of this. Um, like let's take this for an example. Um, would you rather somebody take your life or somebody take your right to bodily autonomy? I mean, I suppose it depends on what it means for somebody to take your right from bodily autonomy. Um, but I think a lot of people would go ahead and say, like, no, look, I would still like to live if I didn't have bodily autonomy. Now, I think there are cases where people can very plausibly say that they wouldn't want to live if they don't have bodily autonomy, right? I mean, these are like absolutely tragic and terrible and I mean, just absolutely reprehensible examples, or at least they're examples of reprehensible actions which societies used to take, or which our society used to take. But you can think about slaves, and one of the major forms of resistance for slaves, right, or enslaved people, was to commit suicide. If it was on the slave boats, in the transatlantic slave trade, oftentimes what you would see is you would see that enslaved people from Africa would essentially commit suicide by jumping off the boat. And their reasoning makes sense in that case. It's that they would rather not live than live a life of bondage. But I think we can go ahead and at least understand the point of view that, in general, people will say that the right to life is more important than the right to bodily autonomy, at least because, right, you cannot have bodily autonomy if you don't have a life. Okay. Now, there's maybe another sort of argument that we can put in the traditional pro-life camp, right? Um, Sort of an alternative argument, which is similar but distinct in a meaningful sense. Um, right, and it's gonna be something like this. Fetuses may be moral persons, but we don't know, and it would be immoral to take the risk of killing a fetus, of killing a potential moral person. We'll put it that way. Okay, sorry about that. Someone's car alarm went off. That's why you should not record a lecture from a parking lot. Take that as a bit of advice if any of you guys go on to teach. Okay, sorry, let me do this. Now, this argument, I think, kind of makes sense. Now, all right, I may be jumping the gun a bit here, but we'll go ahead and do this. Take take this as an example, right? Or take this. This is kind of like a common view that people have. People often think of pregnancy, right? Think about this as a timeline. So, the beginning of this timeline is conception, and the end of this timeline is birth. They may think that at the end, you know, somewhere definitely in this range, right? The fetus is a moral person. And then they may think, well, in this range, the fetus is not, this is a fancy philosophy symbol for not a moral person. That's sort of like a standard point of view. Some people may go ahead and they may argue, like, okay, well, at what point can we say that it's a moral person or not? And some sort of pro-life arguments, or some arguments to say that the fetus is a moral person, they'll say essentially something like this. Picking any of these points in the middle, is completely arbitrary. Why would we care about any of these points? And we'll go into that in a little bit. Um, so we should pick the least arbitrary point. And the least arbitrary point would be something like conception. That's supposedly the view. Or like that's kind of like the first argument, the first traditional pro-life argument. The second traditional pro-life argument would be something like, well, look, we can't actually know at what point it becomes a person. And maybe it seems like it's not a person at this beginning point, this beginning circle here, but like we can't pinpoint an exact thing. So why are we taking the risk? Now, I think that the traditional pro-life argument is um less strong, or sorry, the second traditional argument is less strong than the first one, in my personal opinion, right? And to some extent, I have no problem, you know, asserting my opinion. I actually think that it's very healthy to hear what your professors and instructors think. And the reason I think that the second argument, right, is not as good as the first argument is because I think it would be unreasonable to say, right? So we're just taking it as a fact, right, that bodily autonomy matters. Let's take that as a fact. If there is no reason to violate somebody's bodily autonomy, you should not violate their bodily autonomy. Seems very plausible. It would be strange to say, look, we don't know if this is actually a life, but the risk of it turning out to be a life and us aborting this fetus when it is a life outweighs the known fact that we're going to violate your bodily autonomy, right? That seems to be kind of shaky to me. Okay. Now, the very traditional pro-choice argument is going to be something like this, at least kind of in the public conception, right? Um, it's going to be, or this isn't the, but it is a traditional argument. Fetuses are not moral persons, and thus respecting a woman's right to bodily autonomy in the case of abortion does not violate anybody's right to life. and thus abortion is permissible. All right. This seems like pretty obvious in my opinion, right? Um, if it's the case that fetuses actually aren't moral persons, right? Again, we take it that bodily autonomy matters. We don't want to disagree with that, right? Bodily autonomy matters for everybody. Um, so if a woman exercising her bodily autonomy doesn't infringe on the rights or well-being of anybody else, right? The fetus, assuming the fetus is not a person, then of course it should be permissible. That seems like a completely standard argument, or a completely fair argument, assuming that a fetus is not a person. Here's the issue, though, right? Um, whether a fetus is a person is a complicated metaphysical question. And by like metaphysical, I mean this, okay, I know some philosophers in this department who would hit me with a stone if I described it this way. But like roughly what I mean is metaphysical means something that's true, right? Or a study of something which isn't physical, right? So like questions about math in a way, like how do numbers exist? Right? We think seven's a real thing, but like I can't see seven, I can't touch seven, I can't smell seven, it doesn't exist like spatio-temporally. That seems to be a metaphysical question, right? Because we are talking about um something that seems to exist or something that seems to be true, um, but it's not true because of any sort of physical fact. Or at least it's not true exclusively because of some sort of physical fact. And whether a fetus is a moral person doesn't seem to be true because of a physical fact, right? This is a metaphysical question. And look, I'm a certified metaphysics hater. That's probably cringe to a lot of philosophers. It is cringe to a lot of philosophers. Um, so I don't like going into these metaphysics questions. I think that they may not necessarily be meaningless, but or I don't think they're meaningless, but they're very difficult to answer, at least. And some people have tried to answer the question, right? They tried to give standards of what it means to be a moral person to try and answer this question, right? Let's go over a couple standards, right? One standard which you're going to get in kind of like popular discourse, or one type of standard, is that the personhood depends on some sort of physical characteristic. Right. Um, so for example, oftentimes you hear people say like, I believe that abortion is permissible until there's a heartbeat. Or they'll say, well, within a month or two, I can't remember the exact timeline, but within a surprisingly short amount of time, like the baby starts to have human features or features which you would imagine, like, or which most adult humans have, or which most born humans have. Whether it's like arms or fingernails or whatever. Now, this doesn't really work, right? At least in my opinion. And the reason it doesn't really work is because it doesn't really follow from a physical fact, right? That that person has any level of importance, right? And what I mean by this is, okay, imagine this. Let's say we're saying abortion is impermissible if a fetus has a heartbeat. Well, let's just imagine some sort of situation where we have a fetus that doesn't have a heart. Um, or not a fetus, a person, a baby that doesn't have a heart, but it's still living. It doesn't need to make sense, right? What we're doing with these kind of very fanciful scenarios, we're not trying to see if they're scientifically possible. We're just trying to see what our intuitions about the case tell us. And based upon our intuitions, we can try and gather some sort of moral insight, right? That's very important to know. right? This is kind of how ethicists work. If you have a baby that doesn't have a heart, but it's still living miraculously, maybe it has some sort of mutation, which, has some sort of alternative thing to a heart, or maybe it has a robot heart, or maybe it's just like it's a medical mystery. Nobody knows how it's living, right? Whatever. Well, we would still want to say that that baby deserves moral respect. It's not okay to kill that baby. Uh, so okay, like that doesn't really seem to follow. Um, and again, right, philosophers don't just intend moral persons to mean humans, although I think most philosophers think that the only moral persons that we know exist are human, but if there are aliens, if there are Martians that don't have hearts, they may be moral persons. Um, you could say something like, you know, a moral personhood is dependent on intellectual capability. And the issue with this is there are people who deserve moral respect. There are moral persons who um don't have the full cognitive capabilities that we would expect of a typical person, right? Typical person, that sounds too harsh. I mean your average person. That's what I mean. I mean babies are an example of this, or people with severe mental disabilities. Um, so it doesn't seem like we can base it off of intellectual capability. Sometimes we'll say like uh socialization, whether or not someone's integrated to society, but again, like babies don't have this. We also don't think it would be okay to kill, sort of like a loner who lives in the woods who hasn't seen anybody since, I don't know, 1972, right? He's only talked to 5 people in his life. We wouldn't think it's okay to kill that person. So this is my point here. This question is really fucking hard. It just is. It's very difficult to answer. Um, and what philosophers have tried to do, since people oftentimes credit Thompson, who's the first bit of reading, the first author that I assigned you guys to read an essay of theirs. Um, what philosophers have kind of tried to do, um, sorry about that, is they've tried to essentially sidestep this question. And they tried to ask, okay, well, like maybe we can try and avoid talking about whether or not the fetus is alive or not. And we can ask something like this, right? Because most people, they'll say, assume the fetus is alive or is a moral person. Is it permissible? Is it ever permissible to have an abortion? Now, the reasoning here would be this, right? If the fetus is not a moral person, then most people believe that having an abortion would just essentially be the same as having almost like a cosmetic procedure, you know? Um, you're okay, sure, you're changing your body, um, or you're having some procedure done on your body, but if it's not a moral person, like, okay, of course it's going to be permissible. Some people shockingly disagree with this. I'm not going to assign any of those arguments, but I think that this is at least very plausible. And I think most people would intuitively hold this to be the case, right? That if it's not a moral person, right? If the fetus isn't a person, then it doesn't have moral significance. And we should value the woman's right to bodily autonomy. That seems very straightforward. But philosophers are now often asking questions like, okay, let's say it is a moral person. Is it the case that abortion is going to be morally impermissible, or is abortion ever going to be permissible, even if it is a person? And Thompson really opened the door um, to this question, right? Essentially, in short, what she tried to argue is that somebody's right to life or a person's right to life. I'm probably paraphrasing this a little bit, but I think it's pretty um, a pretty honest representation of what she says, right? A person's right to life does not entail anything directly about what responsibility other people have to them. Or Thompson is actually going to say this much weaker. She's going to say does not always entail any direct, wait, anything. Yeah, does not always entail that other people have some sort of responsibility towards them. I'm kind of starting to second guess how I wrote this on the board, but we're just going to go with it. We're just going to move on. Right. And essentially, right, what we're going to focus on instead of focusing on whether or not it's a life is we're going to focus on what responsibility does the mother, or we could say pregnant woman if you don't believe it's a person, right? Although we're assuming it's a person, so we can just say mother. What responsibility does the mother and or physicians have towards the fetus? Now, one kind of point which I think is in the background of her essay is this, right? We could go ahead and say, look, the right to life is more important or better, right? It's better for somebody to live than it is. Okay, what am I trying to say? We have to choose between two options, or there are two options. The first option is a person loses their right to live, right? But someone else keeps their right to bodily autonomy. And the second option is a person loses their bodily autonomy and the other person loses their right to live. We could say just like, okay, what's worse? Somebody dying or somebody losing their right to bodily autonomy? But that doesn't actually necessarily imply anything about what people have to do. It could very well be the case that someone's permitted to do something, even though it would be better if they had acted otherwise. Let me give you an example. Take charity. There are plenty of charities which, if you donate to them, you will likely save a life. You can actually Google this. Plenty of charities. And there are plenty of people who have disposable income. Look, I am a semi-professional philosopher and a PhD student. I still somehow buy things that are fun. I have disposable income somehow as a semi-professional philosopher. Tiny bit, but some. It may very well, but I could use the disposable income, which I use for my beer money or, which I use to get shots at the bar or whatever, you know. I could use that. That's what grad students do, by the way. I could use that for charity. But the question is, do I have to? Like, am I doing a moral wrong if I decide to go out and get shots instead of donating that money to charity? And I think most people would say, no, you're not doing a moral wrong. It would be better if you donated it to charity, right? But you're not doing a moral wrong by not doing it. So it may very well be the case that, look, it would be better if the mother uh, protected the life of the moral person. Again, we're assuming that this is a moral person for the sake of argument, right? But she doesn't have a responsibility to do so. And let's think about what a mother's responsibility to do so. Thompson gives two very convincing cases, or considers two very convincing possibilities, right? Um, the first possibility she considers, right, is pregnancy in the case of rape. And she considers her very classic violinist scenario. Oh. So, in this scenario, she imagines that a woman wakes up and she's in a hospital, and her, blood or some of her bodily materials, that sounds weird. Uh, but some part of her body, right, is hooked up to a machine to this violinist. And, this is like a world famous violinist. This is one of the best violinists in the world. And the question which she asks is, okay, now let's imagine that she has to be hooked up to this violinist for 9 months. Um, is it, her responsibility to um to essentially be dedicated for 9 months to um donating part of her body and using part of her body, like, quite substantively, right? Um, to let this violinist survive. And she has, I think, the very sensible intuition that no, the woman doesn't have the responsibility to the violinist to give part of her body to the violinist, and she doesn't have the responsibility to dedicate that amount of time to the violinist. I think that's very, um, I think that's very compelling. And she essentially gathers from this, again, the very sensible intuition that if a woman did not have any sort of say, right, or if the woman did not have control over the conception at all, if it was caused by rape, then she hasn't taken up any responsibility, and it would be unfair to put that responsibility onto her. I think that's a very compelling argument. Um, Now, it may be the case, right? It may very well be the case, right? And assume that it is a person, that it would be nice of her to let the violinist or to let the fetus grow and live, right? But the question isn't what would be better for her to do. The question is, what is she required to do? And then there's a further question of what should we legally require her to do? She also thinks about cases uh, where the mother's life is at stake, right? Pregnancies where the mother's life is at risk. And she gives two different cases to kind of explore this topic. The first case, this is the most bizarre case, right? But it's the case of the growing baby in the house. Um, so imagine this. Uh, a woman's in a house. She owns the house, right? And it's a tiny little house, one of those small homes. And the doors are locked for whatever reason. There's no way out. She can't escape through the window. And there's this baby. She takes a look. It's a regular sized baby. And then she notices that the baby's growing and growing and growing, like monstrously large, quite rapidly. And she realizes that the baby is going to crush her to death. And in order to stop her from being crushed to death, she has to kill the baby. She takes from this the intuition that it would be permissible for her to kill the baby. I think that this case is a little less clear than the violinist case. I think it's plausible. right? That in this like very fanciful case, uh, that the woman maybe has the right to kill the baby. Um, I don't think it's clear though. In fact, I personally find it much more intuitive to say, just hey, imagine a woman's pregnant and she's going to die if she carries the fetus to term. Does she have the right to an abortion, even if the fetus is a person? I would intuitively say yes, she does. Um, I'm not sure if I would intuitively say that about the growing baby case. Perhaps that's just a mismatch in my intuitions or something like that. Um, but she takes it to be the case that the woman can kill the baby to save her own life. And this to some extent makes sense, right? We generally hold that people are allowed to prioritize themselves in some way. So imagine this. You are hooked up to some machine. It's like a jigsaw-like trap, if you've seen the movie Saw. And you notice that there's another person hooked up to the machine. And then suddenly, Jigsaw comes on the TV and he says, okay, you have a button right in front of you. Um, you press the button and the other person dies. If you don't press the button, you're going to die. I think a lot of people will have the intuition that it is permissible for you to press the button because it is permissible for you to prioritize yourself over other people. Not in any situation, right? Like it wouldn't be okay for me to kill everyone in the city of Chicago to save my own life. But I get some leeway, right? Some moral leeway when my own well-being is at stake, especially if it's my life that we're talking about. Now, she gives this other example, right? Um, 1 second, sorry. And I think this example is much more compelling, right? Two people fighting over a coat in a blizzard that one of them owns. So imagine this. You're in a blizzard with somebody, and you guys are gonna like you're gonna freeze to death if you don't have a coat. Now you lent, just truly just lent, like for the day, right? Your big winter coat. I used to live in Michigan. I have a few of these. You lent your big like winter coat to the other person, and they're wearing it, and suddenly you get trapped in this blizzard. The question is it permissible for you to take the coat away from that person and put it on? And her intuition is like, yeah, of course it's permissible. It's your coat. Again, maybe it would be nice if you let them live. Maybe it would be honorable in some sense, but it's not required that you do so. And she takes this to be the case with pregnancy, right? The coat in the house, right, is supposed to be analogous to the woman's body. Um, the the baby is in your house, right? The baby is in your body. The person is in your coat, right? They need those to live. And the question is it permissible for you to take the coat? And she says yes. And from that, she thinks, okay, it's thus permissible for you to take your own property to save somebody else's life. Now, there is like quite plausibly a disanalogy between um all of these cases, right? And pregnancy. And the disanalogy is arguably that um there is no relation to any of the people in these cases to the woman, but there is a relation between a woman and her unborn child. This is plausible, like a plausible disanalogy, um, especially to I think the coat example and the baby example. I think that it's like I personally don't think that the disanalogy justifies like a change in opinion. Um, I think that it's pretty crazy in the case of rape to say that the disanalogy really matters, personally. I mean, you can make this argument. Look, I don't want to say it's crazy because I want you guys to make the arguments which you have, but just like my personal intuition here, right, is that it's unreasonable to say that the disanalogy makes a difference in the case of pregnancy via rape. Um, because we would generally want it to be the case that if there's any sort of substantive moral concern about someone that they have like a relationship with, like they have some sort of choice in the matter. But maybe that's wrong, right? Like I didn't choose who my brothers were, um, but I plausibly have some moral responsibility towards my brothers, you know? Um, but yeah, that's a possible disanalogy to consider, right? A possible way someone could respond to Thompson. Now, there's some important moral considerations here. Um, that I want to kind of cover for a bit. Okay. All right. One important consideration that Thompson makes is what a third party can do. Right. Now, again, this is medical ethics. We're talking about what doctors can do and what doctors should do. Um, and she essentially thinks like, okay, imagine the baby scenario. She thinks it's quite obvious that the woman in the house can kill the baby. She doesn't think it's obvious that someone who's walking by can break into the house and kill the baby at the request of the woman. She doesn't think that's obvious. Um, so what this may show is that maybe it's okay for the woman to go through with an abortion, but it's not okay for someone to assist her with it. Now, this would be like pretty devastating to abortion rights. Um, like at home abortions which are not done under medical supervision, or not done by medical professionals, they're very dangerous. Um, in fact, one of the main concerns which people have against, for example, the overturning of Roe v. Wade in a variety of different states is that it's going to essentially prompt women to do unsafe abortions. Um, if we had more time, I'd go into consequentialism and deontology and how that relates to this, but unfortunately, not have more time. So I'm just gonna have to gloss over that, right? But that is something to know, right? Like this would have a major impact on the discussion of abortion rights. If we said it's okay for the woman to have an abortion, but it's not okay for someone to assist her. By the way, this is also an argument that comes up in the medical in dying cases. Um, Now she thinks, right, Thompson thinks that the code example shows that someone can actually assist in an abortion. Um, right, so I see these two people struggling for their coat, and she thinks it would be okay for me to step in and say, wait, who owns the coat? And then they both say, oh, that guy owns the coat. I think it's Smith and Jones, or the example, right? So they both say, oh, Smith owns the coat. She thinks it would then be fine for me to say, okay, well, let me take the coat from you, Jones, and then forcefully take the coat from Jones and then give it to Smith. I think that seems plausible. There's a question about why intuitions may differ between the baby case and the coat case, right? If they're supposed to be like relatively analogous, and which case fits better, as an example of, fits better with abortion. But still, um, another consideration, right? Um, for that we should think about, which she doesn't really address, is the difference between killing and letting die. A lot of people are going to intuitively hold that it is worse to kill someone than it is to let them die unnecessarily. Okay, I'm going to spoil a movie that came out, what, like 20 years ago. The movie's probably older than a substantial amount of you guys, right? But in Christopher Nolan's first Batman movie, um, at the end of the movie, Ra's al Ghul, he's Liam Neeson's character, he tries to destroy Gotham and he's on a train and the train's about to go off the tracks. And he looks up to Batman and he's like, oh, well, you need to save me now. And then Batman says, like, I'm not going to kill you, but that doesn't mean I have to save you, right? And then he glides away and then he lets Ra's al Ghul die. He lets Liam Neeson die. A lot of people think, like, look, it would be much worse if Batman like just shot Ra's al Ghul in the head, right? Than it would be if he just let him fall off. Maybe it's still bad, but maybe it's permissible in some cases, And actually, this may be the difference between the two cases, right? In the first case with the baby, the woman has to kill the baby herself. In the second case with the coat, you just essentially let someone die from the elements. And maybe this is what makes a difference. Now, I don't have the time to go into different types of abortions. I mean, look, if we had a lot more time, and if also I was a medical expert, I hate to say it, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a medical expert, um, then we could go into this in more detail. But there is actually quite plausibly or possibly a difference, or like, I don't know, what am I trying to say? This may actually relate to different types of abortions. Um, there are some types of abortions, particularly those that happen early on and use some methods, which I think are better characterized as the woman not giving or cutting off resources to the fetus. And there are other types of abortion which are uh, better characterized as the woman or the doctor deliberately ending the fetus's, I don't want to say life, right? I don't want to beg the question here, but existence, whatever term we want to use, right? So if there's a difference between killing and letting die, then that may actually have an effect on abortion, right? On abortion ethics. Now, here's a question. What about consensual sex? Thompson, she essentially um, gives two very compelling cases. I mean, I think these are very compelling cases. I think that they're intuitive. Besides the baby case, I don't think that that really helps her argument very much. But I think she makes a very good argument that the fetus can be a life, and um, it's permissible to have an abortion in the case of rape. She also gives a very good argument that it's uh, permissible to have an abortion in the case of um, where the mother's life is at stake. But we can take an instance of consensual sex, right? So what about consensual sex where the mother's life is not at risk, right? She takes this to kind of be like the standard case of an abortion. She says that these other cases are quite rare. Very, very unfortunately, cases of pregnancy because of rape and cases of pregnancy because where the woman's life is at stake, that's not as rare as the vast majority of people would think, right? Um, very tragically, right? Like very terribly. Um, but does her argument say anything, right, about these kind of what she calls more general cases, or what she considers to be more general cases? And not exactly, right? So if it's the case that the woman said was, let's go back to the violinist scenario. Let's say she makes a gamble, this woman, and she says, "Oh, I'm going to try and do this thing, and there is a chance that I'm going to be hooked up to this violinist, that I'm going to be in this scenario." The question is, if that happens, does she essentially have a responsibility to the violinist? And I think a lot of people would intuitively say yes. You took that responsibility up to yourself, right? Um, I honestly think that can kind of be like a pretty callous way of looking at things, but I do think that that is an intuitive thing that people have. If you make it a case where it is clearly not, or sorry, it clearly is a moral person, like a case where it's a full-grown adult, like the violinist case, most people would say, well, you took that risk yourself. Um, Now, there are questions that arise, like, what if the woman used, I shouldn't just say the woman, right? Because presumably the man that she had sex with, the man who impregnated her, right? This would be sort of part of what they both did together. But what if the parents used contraceptives or used birth control? There is no form of birth control that's or pretty much no form of birth control, or the common forms of birth control are not 100% effective, right? Condoms are not 100% effective. Uh, uh, Birth control pills are not 100% effective. Um, Different medical implants are not 100% effective. Um, Vasectomies are not 100% effective. Um, what you could say is, well, if the parents use some form of birth control, then they have essentially done what they can, or they have taken some level of precaution to avoid pregnancy. And if that's the case, then it could seem cruel, um, or it's quite plausibly cruel to essentially be like, well, you already risked it, you know? Like there's some level of risk, right? Whenever I get on a plane that it's going to be hijacked. I can't be held responsible, right? Or like my uh uh you know, I think it would be pretty cruel and weird to be like, no, Levi, you knew that there was a 0.00000 however many zeros 1% chance that a plane would get hijacked, and you decided to fly on this safe airline, and you did, so you're just gonna have to suck it up, right? Like I think that would be kind of insane to say. I think that would intuitively be weird to say. It may be the case, right? There are some forms of birth control which are more effective than others, right? So maybe it's the case if what doctors call the withdrawal method, but it's the pull-out method, right? Maybe it's the case that like, well, like that's much less effective than using a condom. So maybe, this is all again assuming that the fetus is alive, or a person. Maybe that would be uh maybe if you used, the pull-out method, then you shouldn't be allowed to have an abortion, but if you used a condom, then you should. There are all sorts of different things we could say about this. Now, David Boonin, who's actually a professor here. Now, we didn't read his article because it's actually a book, but the second reading actually summarizes it. Um, he tries to argue that we can essentially extend a very similar, or make a very similar argument to Thompson's, which would say that abortion is always permissible in consensual sex, or is always permissible, even if the sex was consensual, and even if the mother's life is not at stake. And I think his argument has a lot of plausibility to it. Essentially, what he says is There is good legal precedence to um, suggest that a government can never coerce somebody to use their body to save another person's life. All right, this is his argument. And he uses this one legal example, and then he essentially tries to extend that to pregnancy. Um, Now, I don't want to break down those other two essays as much. One, because I've already been talking for quite a while here, and two, I think that they're more straightforward than Thompson's essay. I mainly wanted to break down Thompson's essay. But it's really important to note, right, that there is a difference between um, what is permissible for somebody to do and what is permissible for the government to make somebody to do. What do I mean by this? There are plenty of instances where somebody intuitively shouldn't do something, but it would be wrong for government to force them to do it. Let me give you an example, right? I think one of the essays said this, you shouldn't lie to your friends, or you shouldn't cheat on your spouse. I personally don't want the government to enforce that I shouldn't cheat on my spouse. I'm not married, but still, if I was, maybe some people disagree with this. I don't think it would be okay for that. And this really does open up a really important question, which is when should the government step in? And this is a very difficult question to answer. We don't just want to say that the government should step in when it would be good, right? Or when stepping in would promote better outcomes. Because then the government should force you to donate to charity. And I don't want the government to force you to donate to charity. We um, wouldn't also want to go ahead and say that the government should step in if the outcome is like extraordinarily better, right? Because like we can imagine some situation where like, hey, look, if you take your money and give it to its charity, then it would be like extraordinarily benefit the public. So I'm hesitating because actually maybe that would be good. But people disagree with that, right? Like for example, a lot of people disagree that the government should force Jeff Bezos to donate, $100 billion to charity or whatever. A lot of people think that he should, right? And going into that's going to go into like way too many political caveats and stuff like that. I don't have time to do it, right? But a lot of people don't want to say that, and that brings up a lot of different questions. Um, One thing is that the government should maybe protect people's rights. Rights are different than what people ought to do. So somebody can have the right to do something, but they shouldn't necessarily do it. Let me give you an example, actually, which relates. Uh, no, let me give you this example, right? People have freedom of speech in this country, and freedom of speech extends to hate speech. A lot of people think it doesn't. It does. Um, People have the right to say slurs. And I think there's plausible reason to say that the government should protect that right. Look, I don't want people saying slurs, but I also don't want the government saying what people can and can't say, um, in the vast majority of cases. So it may be the case that someone has the right to do this, but they shouldn't, right? So maybe the government should just protect somebody's right. And this opens up a question which Thompson really explores, which is essentially allowing a woman to choose what to do with her body, is that violating the fetus's right to life or the fetus's supposed right to life? And she argues no. All right. the main thing which I really wanted to do here is I really wanted to show you guys intricacies of the abortion debate, right? Which wasn't just abortion good, abortion bad, right? There can be intricacies. There could be two pro-choice people, right? And one of them who have genuine disagreements, right? Like substantive disagreements. One of the pro-choice uh 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 people could say, I don't think it's a life, and thus I think it's permissible. I think that we need to respect the woman's bodily autonomy. But if it was a life, then we shouldn't respect the woman's bodily autonomy in that case because the life outweighs it. And another person could very well go ahead and say, no, we think that we should always respect somebody's bodily autonomy, and that respecting somebody's bodily autonomy doesn't violate somebody's right to life, or it doesn't violate the fetus's right to life. Right? These are substantive disagreements, right? Which I think are lost in the general abortion debate, right? Like the debates that the general public has. And I think recognizing these intricacies is really, really, really important. Okay, I'm going to stop this right here. Yeah, thanks for making it through the video. Hope you guys aren't too angry, you know?